If you think you understand watching another woman publicly steal your husband, you are mistaken. You will never know until you sit among 800 elites, watching her toast to your ruin, completely unaware her very stage belongs to my family. Take a deep breath and listen. I am not a weeping wife hiding in a restroom. I am about to give you an expensive masterclass on burning an empire to the ground without ever raising my voice. Hello, viewers of Violet Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for being here with us today. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled our monetization feature, leaving our channel without a budget to operate and support our hardworking team. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our staff can cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donate link in the description or comments section. My name is Lucy Martin, and I am 34 years old. I did not find out my husband, Garrett, was having an affair because I found a smudge of cheap lipstick on his collar or caught a late-night text message on his glowing phone screen. Those are the sloppy mistakes of careless men, and Garrett always prided himself on being meticulous. No, my discovery was far more clinical. It was a slight, almost imperceptible deviation in the quarterly financial report for a commercial development project he was managing. Most wives look for the lingering scent of another woman on a jacket sleeve. I looked at the profit and loss margins. A fractional percentage was missing, diverted into a ledger that did not belong in our standard operating procedures. To the untrained eye, it was a rounding error. To me, it was a glaring beacon of betrayal. Instead of throwing a glass at the wall or screaming his name across our marble foyer, I did what I was raised to do. I observed. For 6 long weeks, I sat in complete silence and meticulously tracked the hidden cash flow. I became a ghost in his financial ecosystem. I traced every redirected cent through shell accounts and offshore transfers. It did not take long to see the pattern. Garrett was siphoning money from a concealed corporate slush fund to purchase a high-end luxury apartment in the most expensive district of the city. The title of this pristine property was not in his name, nor was it hidden under a holding company. It belonged entirely to a woman named Sloane Sterling. Knowing the truth is a heavy burden, but concealing it requires the absolute precision of a surgeon looking directly into a gaping wound. I maintained our perfect domestic illusion without missing a single beat. Every single morning, I woke up at exactly 6 o'clock, ground his favorite dark roast beans, and brewed his coffee just the way he liked it. I handed him his porcelain mug with a warm, steady smile. "Thank you, darling," he would say, entirely oblivious to the fact that I was mentally calculating the exact hour I would destroy him. I sat across the kitchen island, sipping my green tea, nodding sympathetically as he fed me elaborate lies about sudden, mandatory business trips to Seattle. "I will miss you so much, Garrett," I would reply, my voice perfectly pitched with false longing. "Make sure you get some rest." While he was supposedly in Seattle, which I knew was actually a penthouse just 3 miles downtown, I made a phone call. I reached out to the private legal team of the Martin family. Garrett always seemed to forget the sheer magnitude of the family he married into. The Martins do not just have money. We control the largest and most extensive logistics and industrial real estate network across the entire American Midwest. Our family name opens doors before we even knock. Our lawyers do not negotiate. They execute. Over secure, encrypted lines. I instructed them to prepare a net so tight and so absolute that Garrett would not realize he was caught until he was already suffocating. We drafted emergency ethical clauses, prepared asset freezes, and initiated corporate takeovers. The culmination of my 6 weeks of silence was the annual fundraising gala. I took personal care in selecting my attire for the evening at the Astor Grand Hotel, in a room full of women competing to outshine one another in crimson silk and diamonds. I chose a muted, pale steel gray gown. It was a terribly expensive dress, but its true value was in its camouflage. I deliberately dressed to blend into the background. I wanted to look like a shadow, a dutiful and unassuming wife standing obediently beside her successful husband. I was willingly yielding the entire stage tonight to those who love to perform. Let them have the spotlight. The executioner rarely wears bright colors when they step up to the block. The ride to the event was a masterclass in atmospheric pressure. The interior of our luxury town car felt thick, choked with the unspoken tension radiating from my husband. For the entire 30-minute drive, Garrett could not keep still. He shifted uncomfortably in his tailored tuxedo, his fingers aggressively tapping the screen of his phone, answering messages he thought I could not see. His breathing was shallow, his mind clearly somewhere else, or rather, with someone else. I did not look at him. I did not ask who he was texting. I simply turned my head to the window and rested my chin on my hand. I calmly watched the city lights blur past the tinted glass. I looked up at the towering steel and glass skyscrapers dominating the skyline, silently admiring the architectural marvels that my grandfather had personally helped build from the ground up. This was my city. This was my empire. And Garrett was nothing more than a temporary tenant whose lease was about to expire. The Astor Grand Ballroom was a sprawling cathedral of modern vanity, a towering monument to excess where the wealthy came to perform for one another. Overhead, massive crystal chandeliers that cost $500,000 each cast a warm golden glow over a vast sea of billionaires, state senators, and aggressively ambitious venture capitalists. The air in the room was overwhelmingly thick with the heavy scent of roasted black truffles, vintage champagne, and impossibly expensive designer perfumes. It was a fragile ecosystem built entirely on firm handshakes, hollow promises, and the quiet, constant calculation of personal net worth. We had barely stepped past the velvet ropes at the entrance when Garrett abruptly dropped his hand from the small of my back. His commercial smile, the exact one he spent countless hours practicing in our master bathroom mirror every single morning, instantly snapped into place. He muttered a quick, dismissive excuse about needing to secure a vital venture capital contact for his technology startup and vanished into the swirling, glittering crowd. I was left entirely alone at our designated table in the dead center of the room, calmly watching him work the floor. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy, laughing far too loudly at terribly boring jokes, and clapping powerful men on the shoulder with a desperate kind of familiarity that bordered on pathetic. It was precisely 10 o'clock when the real theater of the evening finally began. I saw her long before she ever saw me. Sloane Sterling glided across the polished Italian marble floor like a woman who firmly believed she held the deed to the entire building. She wore a striking emerald green silk gown with a hemline that dragged elegantly behind her, and a thigh-high slit that bordered on scandalous for a traditional charity gala. It was a dress specifically designed to demand absolute attention, a screaming, desperate declaration of her youth and her unchecked audacity. She wove effortlessly through the distinguished crowd, completely ignoring the seasoned corporate wives in their conservative diamond necklaces, her predatory gaze fixed exclusively on my table. When she finally arrived at my side, Garrett materialized right beside her out of thin air, his handsome face a terrifying, rigid mask of sheer panic and forced composure. "Lucy, darling," Garrett said, his voice carrying a slight, trembling pitch that only a wife of 10 years could possibly detect. "I do not believe you have formally met in person. This is Sloane Sterling, the new director of strategic partnerships for my firm." Sloane did not bother to offer her hand in greeting. Instead, she leaned casually against the back of Garrett's empty dining chair, allowing her emerald gown to pool dramatically around the carved mahogany legs. She looked down at me with a sickening smirk, so incredibly rich in false pity that I almost had to admire her sheer nerve. "It is such an absolute pleasure to finally meet the woman Garrett leaves behind when duty calls," Sloane said, deliberately pitching her voice loud enough that the wives of 2 prominent hedge fund managers sitting at the very next table suddenly stopped their private conversation to lean in and listen closely. "Garrett and I have been spending an incredible amount of time together lately. The strategic partnership requires so many exhausting, late-night work sessions. We just understand each other on such a profound, intimate level. Honestly, sometimes I wonder how he even functioned before I came along to manage his most pressing needs. The air around our table seemed to drop 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Garrett looked as though he might physically collapse onto the ornate Persian rug beneath our feet. He darted his frantic eyes toward the eavesdropping wives, then back to my face, bracing himself for the inevitable explosion. He was holding his breath, waiting for the bitter tears, the splashed drink in the face, the hysterical, screaming public scene that would finally allow Sloane to play the innocent victim of an unhinged, fiercely jealous spouse. I gave them absolutely nothing. I slowly turned my head, holding Sloane's challenging gaze with the placid, unblinking stillness of a cold-blooded reptile. I reached out for a silver tray resting on the edge of the white tablecloth, selected a tall crystal glass of vintage Pinot Noir, and smoothly extended it toward her. "You must be terribly parched." "Sloane," I said, my voice perfectly smooth, level, and entirely devoid of any emotional texture whatsoever. "Managing my husband's pressing needs so late into the evening sounds like incredibly exhausting manual labor. Please, have some wine. You look like you could really use the hydration." For a fraction of a second, the triumphant, mocking smirk on Sloane's heavily contoured face faltered. Her perfectly manicured hand visibly twitched as she reached out to take the glass from my fingers. She had marched over here fully prepared for a bloody battle, armed with sharp provocations and boundless youthful arrogance. She had not prepared for absolute, chilling indifference. My total lack of a defensive reaction was a flawless mirror reflecting her own cheapness right back at her, and I could clearly see the sudden, sharp spark of profound insecurity flash behind her dark eyes. "Sloane, we really should go review the silent auction catalog," Garrett stammered out, stepping forward and gripping her bare elbow with enough desperate force to turn her skin completely white. "Right now, we need to go." But Sloane aggressively jerked her arm away from his grasp. The young mistress was entirely out of control now, blinded by her own towering ego and the expensive wine she had likely been drinking since 8 o'clock. She planted her feet firmly on the marble floor, squaring her shoulders in an act of open defiance. She truly believed that tonight, in front of the absolute most powerful and influential people in the entire city, she could force Garrett's hand. She arrogantly thought her striking emerald dress and her bold public insinuations would finally compel him to cast me aside and publicly claim her as his equal partner. She took a long, deliberate sip of the red wine I had just handed her, her eyes practically daring me to do something about her presence. I did not take the bait. I simply looked away from her flushed face, smoothly opened my black velvet clutch, and retrieved my secure mobile phone. I navigated to an encrypted messaging thread with my older brother. I typed exactly 2 words. "It is time." I hit send, placed the phone neatly back into my clutch, and calmly picked up my heavy silver fork. As Garrett continued to silently, desperately plead with his mistress to walk away, his forehead shining with a cold, terrified sweat. I cut a small, perfect piece of my seared scallop appetizer. I placed it in my mouth and chewed thoughtfully, genuinely enjoying the delicate, buttery flavor, as though I were the only living person in the entire grand ballroom. The delicate chime of a crystal glass being tapped repeatedly by a silver spoon echoed through the vast expanse of the ballroom, abruptly cutting through the low hum of 800 overlapping conversations. The towering chandelier lights dimmed to a soft, theatrical glow, directing the collective attention of the room toward the elevated mahogany stage at the far end of the hall. A polished master of ceremonies stepped up to the acrylic podium, his booming voice announcing the keynote speaker of the evening. He introduced my husband with a sickening amount of reverence, calling him a visionary pioneer of the tech industry, a man whose innovative algorithms would shape the next 50 years of software architecture. Garrett practically floated up the carpeted stairs, his chest puffed out, drinking in the applause like a man dying of thirst. He adjusted the lapels of his tailored tuxedo, flashed that practiced, brilliant smile, and leaned into the microphone. For the first 10 minutes, Garrett delivered a perfectly rehearsed corporate monologue, He threw around meaningless buzzwords about vertical integration, cloud scalability, and projecting a valuation of $200 million within the next 36 months. He sounded exactly like every other desperate startup founder begging for capital in a room full of apex predators. But then, his tone shifted. The aggressive, pitching cadence melted into something softer, something artificially intimate. He lowered his voice, gripping the edges of the podium, and began to speak about the driving force behind his recent creative breakthroughs. None of this unprecedented growth would be possible without a profound shift in my personal perspective, Garrett announced, his voice vibrating with feigned sincerity. True innovation requires taking monumental risks. It requires finding new inspiration when you least expect it. As he spoke those specific words, he did not look at the investors. He did not look at his board members, and he certainly did not look at his wife sitting squarely in the center of the front row. Instead, his gaze locked onto the back of the room, fixing directly on the vibrant emerald green silk of Sloane Sterling. The moment the final syllable left his mouth, a smattering of polite, obligatory applause began to ripple through the audience. But before the clapping could swell, a sudden, sharp screech of microphone feedback pierced the air. Sloane had briskly marched right up the side steps of the stage. With a terrifying combination of liquid courage and unbridled arrogance, she physically intercepted the master of ceremonies, snatching the wireless microphone straight out of his manicured hands. The host stepped back in absolute shock, his mouth opening and closing in mute horror. Sloane stood at the very edge of the stage, towering over the front tables. She raised a crystal flute of vintage champagne high into the air, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with the intoxicating thrill of her own manufactured rebellion. "I would like to propose a toast," Sloane declared, her voice booming through the massive speakers, completely lacking the refined modulation required for a venue of this magnitude. "A toast to the real innovators, to the brave individuals who recognize when something has simply run its course. Here is to those who dare to leave behind a barren past to step into a true future." She aimed that final, venomous sentence directly at my face. She stared down at me from her elevated platform, a vicious, triumphant sneer spreading across her lips. In her alcohol-soaked, deeply deluded mind, she genuinely believed she had just executed a brilliant checkmate. She thought she had just publicly claimed her territory, marking me as the obsolete relic being discarded for a newer, shinier model. She stood there, holding her glass aloft, waiting for the applause to validate her grand, dramatic declaration of victory. Instead, the entire Astor Grand Ballroom was instantly plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. It was not just quiet. It was a physical absence of sound, a sudden vacuum of air that felt heavy enough to crush bone. 800 of the most powerful people in the Midwest completely froze. Not a single person clapped. Not a single person raised a glass. You could hear the faint, distant hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. The elite society of this city is built on a foundation of strict, unspoken rules of decorum, and watching a mistress publicly humiliate a legitimate wife on an open microphone was a catastrophic breach of protocol. The billionaires, the politicians, the socialites, they all simply stopped breathing. They sat paralyzed in their velvet chairs, their eyes darting nervously between the girl on the stage and the woman sitting alone at the center table. They were waiting for the explosion. They were bracing for me to scream, to cry, to hurl my dinner plate, to provide them with the tragic spectacle they secretly craved. I denied them the satisfaction, moving with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a sovereign queen holding court. I slowly reached down and picked up my heavy linen napkin. I folded it precisely in half, smoothing the crease with my thumb, and placed it neatly on the table next to my untouched silver cutlery. I looked up at Sloane, who was still standing rigidly on the stage with her arm awkwardly suspended in the air. I offered her a gentle, serene smile. I reached out, took my glass of red wine by the stem, and elegantly raised it toward her in a silent, deeply mocking gesture of acknowledgement. I watched the exact second the reality of the situation crashed into her, The triumphant sneer on Sloane's face began to violently tremble. The abnormal, deafening silence of the crowd was suffocating her, and she suddenly realized that no one was on her side. Her eyes widened in panic as she looked at my perfectly calm smile, her brain desperately trying to compute why the prey was not running. Right at that very moment, before she could even lower her trembling arm, the gigantic, solid oak doors at the far end of the grand ballroom did not merely open, they were violently thrown apart with a massive, echoing thud that shook the crystal chandeliers above and seemed to instantly vacuum the remaining oxygen directly out of the hall. Standing perfectly still in the threshold, framed by the cold, polished marble of the outer corridor, was my father, Arthur Martin. He did not look like a man who had come to passively attend a charity gala. He possessed the terrifying, suffocating aura of an ancient emperor arriving to inspect a newly conquered territory. Flanking him on either side were 3 senior litigators from our family's private legal conglomerate, men whose hourly billing rates could easily bankrupt a small, developing nation in a matter of days. Behind them stood an imposing, impenetrable phalanx of 6 silent men and women, the completely anonymous board of directors of our central holding company. These were the phantom architects of the city, the invisible, ruthless hands that strictly controlled the shipping lanes, the industrial sectors, and the absolute economic lifeblood of the entire Midwestern region. Their collective presence in a public venue was so incredibly rare, so overwhelmingly shocking, that a collective, physical gasp visibly rippled through the front tables of the room. Trailing just half a step behind the massive frame of my father were my mother, Eleanor, and my older brother, Edward. The Martin family did not rush. We absolutely never rush for anyone. When your ancestors built the very ground beneath people's feet, you alone dictate the pace at which the world is allowed to turn. They began their descent down the long, carpeted central aisle, moving together with a synchronized, terrifyingly calm cadence. The massive crowd of 800 powerful billionaires, state senators, and aggressive venture capitalists physically parted before them like a soft block of butter yielding to a searing hot iron blade. Men who routinely and ruthlessly destroyed corporate rivals for breakfast were hastily stepping backward, clumsily tripping over their wives' expensive evening gowns just to clear a wide enough path. No one dared to speak. No one dared to even make brief eye contact with my father. The silence in the room deepened exponentially, transforming rapidly from the awkward quiet of a social faux pas into the reverent, terrified hush of a military tribunal awaiting a final execution order. Up on the elevated mahogany stage, Garrett's meticulously practiced corporate posture completely dissolved into nothing. His broad shoulders instantly slumped, his chest caving inward rapidly as if all the air had been violently punched straight out of his lungs. He stared down at the approaching procession, his panicked eyes frantically darting from my father's cold, impenetrable face to the heavy leather legal portfolio resting securely in my father's right hand. Placed perfectly in the dead center of that thick bonded leather was the unmistakable, glaringly red wax seal of the Federal Court of the United States. It was an emergency legal injunction, authorized and stamped at the highest possible judicial level. The sheer, crushing realization of what that specific document meant hit Garrett with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The delicate crystal wine glass he had been nervously clutching suddenly slipped right through his completely numb fingers. It hit the polished wood floor of the stage, shattering violently into 1,000 glittering pieces. The sharp, explosive sound of the breaking glass echoed loudly off the vaulted ceiling, sounding exactly like the final deadly snap of a heavy guillotine blade. Sloane, still gripping the useless wireless microphone and standing stranded at the very edge of the stage, desperately tried to maintain her aggressive, triumphant posture. She aggressively lifted her chin, thrusting her bare shoulders back in a pathetic, transparent attempt to project strength, fiercely determined to stand her ground against the incoming storm. But she was entirely unprepared for the sheer, suffocating weight of true generational power. As my mother finally reached the front steps of the stage, she did not glare at the young mistress. She did not scowl, nor did she hurl a single, angry insult. In fact, my mother did not acknowledge Sloane's existence in any capacity whatsoever. Eleanor Martin simply glided right past the girl, as though Sloane were nothing more than a poorly placed, cheap synthetic floral arrangement blocking the stairs. It was the most profound, devastating form of psychological annihilation I had ever witnessed. To be screamed at by a wife is to be validated as a legitimate threat. To be entirely, utterly ignored by a woman wearing a priceless, historical diamond necklace is to be reduced instantly to absolute, molecular insignificance. Sloane's fake confidence crumbled into dust instantly, her heavily painted lower lip trembling uncontrollably as she realized she was not even worthy of being considered an insect on our windshield. While my parents steadily approached the center of the stage, my brother Edward smoothly veered to the far left, marching purposefully toward the main audio and visual control booth, hidden just behind a heavy velvet curtain. The frantic sound engineers scrambled chaotically to get out of his path. Edward did not ask for permission or state his business. He simply reached down into the massive soundboard and violently yanked the primary audio cable straight out of the mixing console. A loud, dull pop echoed through the towering venue speakers, instantly killing the electrical power to Sloane's microphone. The chief event organizer, a nervous, sweating man in a cheap, rented tuxedo, rushed forward, stammering out a desperate, shaking protest about strict venue regulations and contracted times. Edward slowly turned to him, his facial expression carved from solid Arctic ice, and calmly adjusted his silk tie. "Do not dare speak to me about venue regulations," my brother informed the man, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried perfectly in the dead, heavy quiet of the room. "The Martin family is purchasing the Astor Grand Hotel in its entirety. The financial wire transfer for the whole property will be completed in exactly 4 hours. Pack your cheap equipment right now and vacate my ballroom." Finally, my father came to a complete halt. He stood squarely in front of Garrett, the polished toes of his bespoke leather Oxfords resting dangerously close to the shattered remnants of the crystal wine glass. My father did not raise his voice to a shout. He did not berate or curse the arrogant man who had foolishly betrayed his only daughter. He simply reached out his large, heavily weathered hand and firmly clamped it down onto Garrett's left shoulder. It was a gesture that might have looked almost paternal, almost comforting to the terrified audience sitting in the dark, but I could clearly see the agonizing, bone-crushing pressure my father was actually applying directly to the collarbone. My father leaned in incredibly close, bringing his mouth just 1 inch away from Garrett's sweating ear. He whispered a single, devastating sentence. I could not hear the exact words from my table, but I saw the immediate, catastrophic, physical result. All the remaining blood aggressively drained from Garrett's face in a fraction of a second, leaving his skin as pale, tight, and waxy as a fresh corpse lying on a freezing mortuary table. His knees immediately buckled under the crushing weight of whatever my father had just promised him, nearly sending him collapsing straight down into the broken shards of glass. But my father's iron grip held him perfectly, agonizingly upright for the entire world to witness his utter ruin. My father finally released his crushing grip on Garrett and took a single, deliberate step backward. This subtle movement was the designated cue for our lead corporate litigator to step forward and address the paralyzed audience. The lawyer did not need a microphone. He had spent his entire career commanding federal courtrooms, and his voice possessed a sharp, cutting resonance that sliced through the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the investment community," the lawyer began, his tone entirely devoid of any warmth or theatricality, "it is my professional duty to inform you that the technology enterprise you have been aggressively funding tonight is nothing more than a hollow corporate shell. The proprietary core system that Garrett claims as his own brilliant innovation does not belong to him. Every single line of code, every algorithmic sequence, and every piece of server architecture is currently leased from a private trust fund registered exclusively under the Martin family holding conglomerate. A collective wave of physical shock washed over the 800 elite guests. I watched the faces of three prominent venture capitalists in the second row instantly drain of all color as they mentally calculated the millions of dollars they were about to lose. The quiet murmurs of the crowd transformed into a rising, frantic buzzing sound. The lawyer calmly opened the heavy leather portfolio and extracted a crisp, perfectly pressed legal document. Contained within the original licensing agreement is an emergency morality and public conduct clause. Due to the catastrophic and highly public breach of this specific clause witnessed tonight, the Martin family is officially activating our right of immediate revocation. As of this exact second, Garrett no longer holds any legal rights to utilize, distribute, or profit from the core technology. The operating license is permanently terminated. Garrett let out a sound that was less than human, a pathetic, strangled gasp of a man watching his entire universe burn to ash in front of him, but the systematic destruction was not yet complete. While the lawyer delivered the final blow to my husband, Sloane desperately clutched her expensive designer evening bag. Suddenly, the bright screen of her mobile phone lit up with an urgent, high-priority email notification. I watched with quiet, profound satisfaction as she frantically swiped open the message. Her eyes darted rapidly back and forth across the screen, her heavily contoured face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The email was a formal notice of immediate termination. She had strutted around this entire evening boasting about her prestigious role as Director of Strategic Partnerships, completely unaware that her employment contract was not signed with Garrett's primary firm. She was on the payroll of a minor, obscure subsidiary vendor, and I was the sole managing director of that specific subsidiary, with a single digital command issued from my phone while I was eating my scallop appetizer. I had frozen her corporate bank accounts, canceled her expense cards, and legally terminated her health insurance coverage. "Garrett," Sloane whispered, her voice cracking violently as panic entirely consumed her. "Garrett, they fired me. My access codes are gone. The luxury apartment lease. They are canceling the lease. Do something. Please do something." But Garrett could not hear her. The litigator had casually tossed the thick stack of revocation documents into the air. The heavy formal papers fluttered down like white snow, scattering across the polished mahogany floor of the stage and mixing with the sharp fragments of the broken crystal wineglass. Garrett violently dropped to his knees, his expensive tuxedo pants tearing against the jagged glass shards. Completely ignoring the sharp pain, he began frantically grabbing at the scattered papers, his hands shaking so violently that he kept dropping them back onto the floor. He was hyperventilating, muttering incoherent, desperate pleas to no one in particular. Sloane grabbed the sleeve of his jacket, begging for him to protect her, to fix the absolute disaster she had initiated. Garrett aggressively shoved her away, his eyes wild and completely unhinged, reducing his young, arrogant mistress to nothing more than a nuisance interfering with his pathetic attempts to gather his ruined life from the floor. Down in the ballroom, the mass exodus of capital had already begun. The illusion was shattered. Within a span of less than 5 minutes, dozens of the wealthiest investors in the city were aggressively pulling out their phones. They were calling their private bankers, yelling at their legal teams, and violently canceling every single funding commitment they had made that evening. Garrett's projected valuation of $200 million evaporated into absolute zero before he could even stand back up on his bleeding knees. Men who had been shaking his hand just 30 minutes prior were now shouting into their devices, severing all ties to avoid the radioactive fallout. The execution was flawless. There was nothing left to conquer. My father offered me a brief, approving nod. Without a single word, the Martin family turned in perfect unison and began our slow, dignified exit down the central aisle. The journalists and society reporters stationed at the back of the room realized the magnitude of the bloodbath they had just witnessed and immediately swarmed the stage like starving vultures. We left behind a completely chaotic, screaming nightmare of ruined contracts and destroyed reputations, perfectly serving Garrett and his mistress on a silver platter for the ruthless media to tear apart. The morning sun offered no warmth, only a glaring, clinical light that mercilessly exposed the absolute wreckage of the previous night. At exactly 9 o'clock, Garrett stumbled through the soaring, pristine glass doors of Ethelgard Technologies. He was no longer the arrogant visionary who had strutted across a mahogany stage just 12 hours prior. He was a desperate, profoundly broken man aggressively searching for a final, pathetic lifeline. His meticulously constructed empire had evaporated into thin air. His wealthy investors had fled like rats from a sinking ship, and his personal bank accounts were completely frozen by my family's legal team. His only remaining play, his absolute last resort, was to sell the hollowed-out corporate shell of his technology startup to Ethelgard Technologies. He hoped to liquidate just enough phantom assets to pay off his immediate, crushing debts and flee the city before the financial regulators began their inevitable investigations. He rode the private elevator up to the executive floor, his breathing terribly ragged, his bespoke tuxedo trousers torn and wrinkled from a night spent in total, suffocating panic. He fully expected to walk into the executive suite and negotiate a desperate surrender with an anonymous, faceless board of directors. Instead, when the heavy oak doors of the chairman's suite swung open, he found me. I was seated comfortably behind a sprawling, polished obsidian desk, my hands neatly folded over a thick leather portfolio. I wore a tailored, razor-sharp black blazer, the absolute perfect attire for officiating a corporate funeral. Garrett physically froze in the doorway. His bloodshot, terrified eyes darted wildly around the luxurious office, desperately searching the shadows for the real executives, completely unable to process the terrifying reality of his immediate situation. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, choking gasp escaped his throat. "Good morning, Garrett," I said, my voice as smooth, cold, and unyielding as a slab of solid marble. "Please, step inside and close the door behind you. We have a great deal of urgent business to conclude, and I highly value my privacy." He stumbled forward like a man walking to the gallows, collapsing heavily into one of the expensive leather visitor chairs. "Lucy!" he wheezed, his voice violently trembling with a pathetic mixture of profound confusion and absolute terror. "What are you doing sitting behind that desk? Where's the chairman of the board? I need to finalize the acquisition documents immediately. I need to sell the company right now." "You have absolutely nothing of value to sell," I replied, leaning slightly forward and resting my forearms on the cool obsidian surface. "And I am the chairman. I am the sole proprietor, the majority shareholder, and the absolute authority of Ethelgard Technologies. But that is not even the most devastating piece of information you are lacking today." I calmly opened the leather portfolio and slid a massive stack of highly classified technical documents across the smooth surface of the desk. They were heavily stamped patent filings, fiercely guarded by the Federal Copyright Office, bearing undeniable legal seals. For 5 long years, you stood proudly on prestigious stages across this entire country and arrogantly accepted countless awards for your brilliant software architecture, I continued, watching his sunken eyes widen in sheer horror as he slowly recognized the complex algorithmic formulas printed on the thick pages. "You genuinely convinced yourself that you were a generational visionary genius, but we both know the real truth. You never possessed the intellect to build that framework. Every single one of those millions of lines of code, the entire proprietary core algorithm that made your name famous and built your false fortune, was written entirely by me. I built every inch of it during those countless, miserable, sleepless nights while you were out entertaining your various cheap distractions, and I quietly, methodically registered every single patent under my maiden name." The last remaining drop of color completely vanished from his face. The realization hit him with the devastating, crushing force of a physical blow to the chest. He did not own the technology. He never did. He was nothing more than a temporary figurehead, a disposable, arrogant puppet I had generously allowed to dance on my stage until he inevitably outlived his usefulness. "You set me up," he whispered, his voice cracking violently as tears of sheer panic finally welled in his eyes. You let me build a massive company around a product I never even owned. I gave you exactly enough rope to hang yourself, I corrected him, my tone utterly devoid of any human sympathy, and you tied the knot with remarkable, breathtaking enthusiasm. I reached into the leather portfolio one final time and pulled out a single, heavily enforced legal document. I dropped it directly in front of his shaking hands. It was a formal petition for absolute divorce. Sign it, I commanded, staring directly into his shattered soul. You will leave this marriage exactly as you entered it, with absolutely nothing. There will be no alimony, no division of shared assets, and zero corporate severance. If you even attempt to fight this in a courtroom, my family's legal team will bury you in aggressive litigation until you are completely bankrupt for the next 3 lifetimes. And before you ask, do not bother looking for any comfort from your young mistress. I made a few strategic phone calls this morning. Sloane Sterling is now permanently and irrevocably blacklisted from the entire technology and corporate sector of this state. She will not even be able to secure a job pouring cheap coffee in a respectable firm. He sat there, a completely shattered, pathetic shell of a man, weeping silently into his trembling hands. There was absolutely no forgiveness in my heart, no lingering affection, and certainly no tears left to shed for a traitor. I calmly reached out and pressed the silver security button embedded seamlessly into the surface of my desk. Within 10 seconds, 2 towering, heavily armed security guards entered the executive office. Escort this man out of my building immediately, I instructed them, my voice echoing with absolute authority. He is no longer welcome on these premises. I stood up from the desk and smoothed the front of my black blazer as the large guards physically lifted my weeping ex-husband by his arms, dragging his dead weight out the door. The entire floor of highly paid engineers and top-tier executives watched in absolute, stunned silence as the former visionary chief executive officer was paraded toward the freight elevator like a common, pathetic trespasser. I did not bother to watch him leave. I simply turned my back, picked up my digital tablet, and strode confidently out of the office and down the long hallway toward the main transparent glass boardroom. The executive committee was waiting for me. I pushed open the heavy glass door, took my rightful seat at the absolute head of the massive conference table, and officially began the very first board meeting as the sole, undisputed founder of Athelgard Technologies, leaving the miserable, forgotten ashes of those who dared to underestimate me far behind in the dust. Hello, viewers of Violet Revenge Stories. I want to take a moment to sincerely and deeply thank you for taking the time to listen to this story today. It truly means the world to our team. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments section below. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping our channel with just $1. YouTube has unfortunately disabled our monetization, and we rely entirely on your kindness. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by using the donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comments. Your generosity directly allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they can comfortably feed their families and continue creating even better stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and stay strong.